So we've started the recording. Let me introduce myself. I'm Niels Mollema. I'm Policy Advisor Climate Justice at ActionAid, the Netherlands. I'm going to ask my other panelists, Souparna, Lahiri, and Teresa Anderson, to also show their videos so that all of you can see who our lovely panelists are. Souparna is a climate policy advisor in the Global Forest Coalition based in India, has a vast amount of experience working with local communities and also involved in the Article 6 negotiations at the UNFCCC, and has a much longer resume that's very much worth summarizing, but I will leave you all to peruse that at some other time. With us, we also have Teresa Anderson. She is a policy coordinator, climate policy coordinator here at ActionAid, and is leading the charge for our COP work and is mostly specialized in land and agriculture and net zero affiliated issues, which makes sense considering the subject of today's webinar. Just to quickly walk you through what you can expect from us tonight, we're going to have the presentations broken up into two shorter rounds. The first is going to be Teresa and Souparna introducing the concepts of net zero, introducing the main hurdles that are in there, and relating it also to the COP. In that time, we're going to take some clarifying questions after that. So make sure that you have those in the question and answer section. That way we can keep track of what has been answered and what hasn't been answered. And if anything is a longer question or requires a more elaborate answer, something that might be handled in the second round, where we dive deeper into what the other options are, what does real zero look like, what are alternatives to net zero, then we'll save those till the end. So we'll make sure that throughout the session, we'll do our very, very best to answer everybody's questions. Teresa, Souparna, would you like to introduce yourselves quite quick, a little bit quickly before we get started as well? Maybe start with Teresa.
Well, I guess you did cover it. I'm climate policy coordinator with ActionAid International, and I've been actually looking at this net zero issue for quite some years now. The language first appeared in 2014. 2015, and we've been investigating the implications of that on climate action and on the global south since that time. So great to be here with you today.
Lovely, thank you. And Souparna.
Hi, good evening from India. So as Niels has already introduced me, my full name is Souparna Lahiri. I'm based in New Delhi, and I am part of the climate team of Global Forest Coalition, looking mainly at the false solutions and also community-driven solutions in the whole climate change debate and discourse. Yeah, I have been following the COP negotiations too, especially that of Article 6, which is again a mix of non-market and market mechanisms. And as part of the false solutions campaign, we are also looking at net zero, NBS, and that's what perhaps Teresa invited me to join you all. Thanks.
You're very welcome, and then I will invite Teresa to kick us off with what the heck net zero actually is and why we should care about it.
You're muted. Yeah,
I'm muting myself. Yes. So hi everyone, thanks for joining this session. I'm sure many of you have by now heard of the phrase net zero, heard it becoming a very popular term in the climate discourse, but also increasingly controversial. So in this first section of the webinar today, I'll just be unpacking just now the overview of why this is a great slogan, but it's actually a very dodgy target. I mean, net zero climate targets have really become super popular. You know, the language of net zero greenhouse gas emissions has been announced by, I think there's thousands now of governments, corporations declaring net zero targets, civil society, media, public. Many scientists are also, you know, talking about net zero climate action as something we need to aim for. It's become synonymous with ambitious climate action. Many assume that it's a good thing. And so we've seen the UK government, who are hosting COP26 at the end of this year in Glasgow, they're really pushing other governments and corporations to declare net zero climate goals, because this is thought to be, by many, the key route for us to ensure that we can try to avoid runaway climate change, that it's synonymous with getting us on the right path to address the climate crisis. So as a result, we've seen a lot of net zero momentum gathering pace. Many countries, including, but not only, the UK, the EU, Canada, France, New Zealand, Sweden, many others, and many corporations now also declaring net zero targets, including the fossil fuel industry, like Shell, BP, Nestle, the food industry and the airline industry like Qantas, and as well as the steel and mining and cement industries. We've also had the dairy industry declaring net zero goals, so, and many others. So lots of people are excited about this. It sounds great. The more, you know, net zero targets that have been announced, presumably the better, most people think. But unfortunately, when you look a little bit closer, you realize that the opposite is true. And that's for a number of reasons. I mean, you can see BP, for example, British Petroleum, as they used to be called, have set a net zero carbon target for 2050. And that was largely celebrated, right? But then you have to ask yourself, well, what 2050, net zero 2050, and we're currently in 2021. So they're really, most of these targets, first of all, are just declaring net zero by 2050, which means that they're talking about net zero in 29, 30 years time. So that's clearly too little, too late. Then we're also seeing increasingly these net zero targets are actually a strategy for companies and even governments to just continue business as usual with their pollution, but greenwash it and make it sound like it's climate action. A lot of these technologies, a lot of these targets actually are assuming that at some point technologies are going to exist to solve the problem, so they can carry on polluting for now. And a big problem, as we'll hear in more detail from Souparna, is about how these targets are likely to end up driving very big land grabs in the global south. So this is a deadly combination, really, because the fact that net zero targets mean that most actors aren't taking real climate action, and that they're relying on technologies and land that don't exist and may never do, this is likely to result in runaway climate change. So to understand a bit more, what is a net zero target? Well, it's really important to understand, first of all, net zero is not actually zero emissions. Net zero is not zero. We really need to, we shouldn't accept it at face value, and we actually have to scrutinize what is being said when corporations and governments talk about net zero. So let's look at this graphic on the right here. You have like, first of all, one way of saying net zero could be 0 tons of carbon dioxide minus 0 tons of carbon dioxide comes to net 0 tons of carbon dioxide. You could have also 10 tons of carbon dioxide minus 10 tons of carbon dioxide. That is also net 0 tons of CO2. And then you have 100 tons of CO2. And if you subtract or remove 100 tons from the atmosphere after you've polluted it, you still have net 0 CO2 emissions. So this net is about what you're doing in your first part of action, plus what you're doing in your second part of action. And that is the point about these net targets. They really combine two different targets. One is what you're doing to stop emitting, and the other one is what you're doing to remove those emissions after you've done the pollution. So that's why the net is so tricky and needs a lot of scrutiny, because people don't realize it's two targets in one. They often assume it's just that first target bringing you down to zero at the start. So we have to look, how big is the net, and how is that carbon going to be removed from the atmosphere, and who's it going to impact when you remove that carbon from the atmosphere, and actually, is it even possible? Is it really going to happen? Because the bigger the net, so like the more net you have, the more you need to do carbon capture, carbon sequestration, carbon offsetting to suck the emissions out the air. And that means that the weaker the target is and the more dangerous the implications are. In the vast majority of these cases with these net zero targets, these are actually more about heavy greenwash. So how can you remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere? Well, really, the only way that works is photosynthesis. So that means, like, you know, the only ability that we have is to rely on plants and chlorophyll's ability to turn carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into solid carbon of trees and leaves and roots and soil. And so that means the only way that we know works is about protecting and restoring biodiverse ecosystems. But given that land, you know, Earth has only a certain number of continents and there is only a certain amount of available land, actually the global capacity to plant new trees to suck carbon out the air is actually quite limited, especially when you compare that to all of the carbon involved in all the fossil fuels that are under the ground at the moment that we're pulling out from underground in the form of fossil fuels and burning those into atmospheric emissions. And really the potential capacity of us to plant planet Earth with trees will never really be able to compensate for all those all that carbon dioxide that we're dragging out and burning from underground. There's also assumptions that, or hopes that technology like carbon capture and storage technology will somehow get working to be able to, that we can use machines somehow to suck carbon out of the air and compress this. So that's what carbon capture and storage technology is about. You've probably heard about carbon capture and storage technology. What you might not have heard is that it doesn't really work, and it may never work. It uses far more energy to suck and compress that carbon into storable form than you actually, and so you use extra fossil fuels to drive your carbon capture and storage, and also the storage element is very, very dicey and seems to be have a strong tendency to leak. So they've never cracked the carbon capture and storage technology. They've invested billions, many billions over decades into this technology. Corporations and governments, especially fossil fuel corporations, are super keen to make this work because they want it to work so that they can, you know, compensate for their continued pollution. But in all likelihood, it will probably never work at scale. But there is even though it may never work, there's a big push to combine carbon capture and storage with bioenergy, BECCS. So bioenergy with carbon capture and storage is BECCS. And the idea is that you could use a lot of trees, plant a lot of trees to absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, cut these down, burn that as bioenergy, and the emissions, instead of allowing the emissions to release into the atmosphere, you capture those emissions and squeeze and store them in your carbon capture and storage machine. But this is a really flawed concept, because both the CCS element is very dodgy, may never work, but also the bioenergy element is going to require a lot of land that we don't have, and the implications of that we'll hear more from Souparna shortly. But unfortunately, most government and corporate targets really rely on these assumptions that there'll be infinite capacity on Earth to do carbon offsetting, to do tree plantations, to plant bioenergy, or that we'll have future technologies to solve the problem. So really net zero is about continuing pollution, but just hoping that at some point you get a post-pollution solution. And that's really why we're trying to flag that this is not a solution to help us solve the climate crisis. We really need real action at source. So I'll leave it there for now, because we can talk more about that second part later.
Thank you very much, Teresa. I think that's a pretty clear introduction into what we're talking about with net zero. I want to now hand it over to Souparna to tell us a little bit more about how this impacts people in the global south and what kind of companies are actually, to what degree companies are actually relying on these types of technologies. You need to unmute first, Souparna.
Yeah, yes. Thanks, Teresa, for the great intro. I'll start by saying that when we get this apprehension, when we really see the word or the term net in all the documents related to whether it's climate policy, climate negotiations, or even biodiversity related conventions as a CBD, or their documents or negotiated text. The immediate realization that comes to us is that why they're using net. Because as we know that the situation that we are in, the crisis that we are in right in 2021, and if we see the kind of reports and studies that are coming out, say IPCC 1.5 special report, or the land report, or the IPBES report on biodiversity loss, we should actually see a kind of a move towards zero, what we call a real zero. So why are we today talking of net zero? What is that net? Why they are calling net and not zero? So obviously, this is a problematic that we identified first, is that where is this net coming from? And so if you know what is offset is, and often we hear this in as part of the climate change solution, obviously we call it a false solution, is that offsets refer to a project where you reduce emissions, mostly somewhere in the global south, and use that reduction. If you can calculate how much carbon you have reduced, and some state or corporations in the global north is handed over that carbon credit, they can show that whatever they can actually emit that much of carbon and continue to emit that the amount of carbon that they have got as a credit from a project which has reduced carbon. Now, this is not zero. And this is where they're coming in with the kind of term or phrase as they use as net. And so you can readily identify that there is something wrong with this concept of when they say net zero, and which Teresa has clearly pointed out where the problem lies. So if we have to really seek a pathway towards zero, a real solution towards zero at 2050, we need zero at that point, the GHG emissions of the carbon emissions should be reduced to zero. But they're saying that we will be net zero at 2050. And this is where the strategy to confuse and detract us from seeking pathways to real solutions and real zero is. So how do they do that? Now, if you see, as Teresa has pointed out, is that a lot of countries, especially within the European Union, and if you can add China to it, has pledged again their net zero commitment with a varying timeline. But on average, it is mostly 2050, with China being at the higher scale at 2060. And we have one or two countries which is 2045 or 2040. But what is driving this is also a slew of corporate pledges. And the net zero race, the race for net zero is also driven by those corporate pledges, where more than 1,500 corporates today have committed to various degrees of corporate commitments and pledges towards net zero. So if you see, what are those? If I share with you about 20 corporate commitments and their pathways, I'm not getting into the commitments which are on average 2050. I'm sharing with you the pathways they are using for their commitment towards net zero. Say Delta Airlines or United Airlines. Let's talk of United Airlines. What they're saying is that they're using offsets, as I mentioned earlier. They're using biofuels. They're using plantations in the form when they say reforestation or restoration, huge amount of land that they need for this restoration, so-called restoration, deforestation. Many of them could be large industrial monoculture plantations, even REDD+ projects. And then, as Teresa pointed out, negative emission technologies such as direct air capture technology. This technology is only being now conceptualized and put into R&D in some cases, and it is still not achievable. And direct air capture technology involves not only pushing carbon down, but it involves a huge amount of energy consumption again, and it can also lead to energy in even oil and gas exploration from those kind of direct air capture technology. And United Airlines is talking about this at a timeline of, say, 2035. So it's 15 years from now, this technology, if it is successful, if it is possible, they are going to use. But before that, they're talking of decarbonization technology, including offsets, plantations, biofuels. If you go to British Airways, they're talking of the same thing: biofuels, offsets, REDD+, renewables. Mind it, when we talk of renewables, we are talking of how they are using investment in renewables to offset. So these are actually renewables used as offsets again to say that we have avoided emissions. So let's be clear about this at this point of time. When you have commitments or pledges, we have three scopes where you can reduce your carbon emissions. And these are basically scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. So scope 1 in emissions are direct emissions, which in terms of the process or mechanism that the corporates, their core functions, how they reduce carbon emission in those core functions. And scope 2 basically is in indirect emission reduction scenario where your offices, your maybe R&D centers, your fleet, your travel, all these, there are scopes of emission reduction. And then scope 3 is basically where your value chain or commodity chains come in. And a lot of these corporations, their main business is done to those scope 3 emission scenarios, the value chain or the commodity chain. So like in scope 2, or in scope 3, you can show that you have used renewables to power your energy consumption, but you can also invest in renewable energy projects to show that the energy that is being generated through those renewable energy projects is that amount of energy is actually your avoiding of carbon emissions in your core functions or in your scope 2 emissions. So this is how they kind of convolute and confuse you in terms of genuine emission reductions. And what we have found out is that their commitments and pledges are mostly targeted towards scope 1 and scope 2 emission reductions. And scope 3 emission reductions are basically, forgotten, and there is not much clarity on how they plan to reduce carbon emissions, which is basically in many cases 70 to 95% of their business. And if you come to the oil giants like Total SA, the whole lot of commitment that they are pledging now is based on, again, restoration, which are like, reforestation of the otherwise savannas in Africa or the Latin America, bioenergy crop production and production of timber and wood from there, nature-based solution programs, and again, as Teresa pointed out, carbon capture and storage technology, which is again a technology which is yet to take shape. And at the scale that is required, we don't even know whether that will be possible or not. Shell follows the same pathway. NBS, offsets, RED+, biofuels, renewables, CCS, negative emission technology. BP, the same. If you come to Nviva, which is a US corporate, this is a company which specializes on raising plantations and then harvesting it, producing wooden pellets to be burned for producing energy, mostly in Europe. And so what they're doing is now is that they're into plantations, they harvest, they produce wood pellets, and these wood pellets are exported to plants in the US, in the UK, like Drax have in UK, to burn them to produce energy. And they're saying that this is renewable energy. And they're also using offsets, basically to, I would say, offset again a lot of their carbon emissions in their core program. And then you come to Drax. So Drax is this energy giant in UK, which uses the wooden pellets which they import, and then they use BECCS, which Teresa was talking about, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, where they use the wooden pellets to produce bioenergy, which they refer to as renewables, and also they can capture carbon and push them in underground. So, and most of the oil giants are basically following this. If you see Eni, an Italian company, they're also into the same kind of things. If you come to like FMCG or other companies like Unilever also, the pathway to their commitment and pledges is the same. They're talking of carbon sequestration. And this carbon sequestration, which is again can be plantations, can be restoration, can be development of carbon sinks, is being used as an offset to claim decarbonization and in many cases going carbon neutral. Apart from using separate offset projects and REDD+ projects, they're also into what we call carbon farming, and they call regenerative agriculture, where the emphasis is on storage and improvement of soil carbon, and they can sell credits. So the regenerative agricultural farms can again sell those supposedly carbon stored in the soil as carbon credits to offset any other carbon emission somewhere else. And these are prospective carbon farms being developed in the US also. Amazon, a very popular corporate in terms of today's corporate world, they're also using the same pathways, and they're also using CCS, they're also using negative emission technology. Apple, which is regarded as one of those who have a better track record in carbon, in net zero pledges and commitments, we see they're talking of nature-based solutions. And I'm going to explain a bit of NBS, where does it come from later in the discussion. But they're also talking of carbon removals. Now you are being confronted with many of these terminologies you may call jargons, which is like carbon sequestration, carbon removal, carbon farming, carbon offsets. And these are all jargons used to trying to make sense that they're all into realistically storing and removing and absorbing carbon from the atmosphere. So whatever carbon we emit here, that can be absorbed by our forest or land somewhere else. And so that becomes, that is neutralized to give you a sense of that this is net zero. And so this is how, even if you go to JBS, a Brazilian giant in livestock and meat production, they are again taking refuge of renewable energy offsets, and then talking of deforestation free commodity and value chain, because they deal in beef, in soya, in palm oil and related products. And so they need to show you that nothing that they procure and trade or sell is from as a result of deforestation in the Amazon or somewhere else in the world, or in Africa or in Indonesia. And so how do they do that? They just pledge and put a timeline, say 2035. By 2035, we will sell and we will retail, we will supply deforestation-free soya, beef, etc., etc. And this deforestation, that they are deforestation-free, will be certified by certain companies. We don't have clarity of how they certify, who are the and how they what are those parameters. But at the end of it, you can pretty well understand that at 2020, if they're talking of deforestation-free supply chain as a pathway to net zero, we are sure that till 2035, you are not getting deforestation-free commodity from them. And that's the hoax that they are trying to promote. Same as Cargill. Cargill is also into carbon farming. They're also into offsets. And if we end by Coca-Cola, this is this is the trend that we are seeing. So when we say that, what are the failings, the fundamental failings of the net zero plans? And it is very clear to us where they're failing. And this is like systemic failure to detail concrete plans to decrease emissions at source. And as I have said, that there is no clarity, even let alone your scope 3 emissions, which is the largest that they have. But even in terms of scope 1 and scope 2, we don't find concrete plans. In turn, what we are seeing that many of the oil companies are talking of, reducing production of oil by say 10 to 40%, but increasing the production of gas and liquid petroleum gas. Some are into methane bed exploration, some are into cold bed methane production, but these are all hydrocarbons. These are huge carbon emitters, and that is what we are constantly saying, that you need to drastically reduce precisely these carbon emissions. And so their business plans indicate that these corporations are continuing to project. And these projections are as we see, a major growth of high emission and polluting products. And so when they are when we are even going into the kind of their sustainability reports, again, as I have said, they are into carbon offsetting, they are into unproven technology, they are into dangerous geoengineering technologies, CCX, BEX, DAC, etc., etc. They don't have lack of credible science and data that we need. And most of all, the billions of dollars that they are pumping into these commitments, implementation of these commitments and pledges, and they run into hundreds of billions of dollars. Today, when the global north is demanding a paltry $100 billion a year climate finance flow to the south, we see in these pledges, billions of dollars are being invested by these corporates into false solutions. Then, financial flows for the real solutions that we need to get out and overcome this crisis. And as you see, if all of these corporates are, their pledges and commitments depend upon such solutions, which are land and forest centric, huge, as Total talks about taking over 10 million hectares of land for restoration in the Republic of Congo, or the Shell talks of 100 million hectares, somebody talks of 50 million hectares. Where is this land coming from, and where will it come from? You cannot have a land use change all over the world at the pace that you need this land and forest to satisfy implementing these pledges and commitments the way they are into. This has huge impact on the communities who depend upon both the land and forests. And as Teresa has already said, science has shown, the IPCC report has clearly pointed out that even for, as we know, that if with a carbon budget, even if it's extended to some extent to 480 gigatons carbon equivalent, there is no room for offsets. And if we talk of restoration, reforestation, plantations, and the geoengineering like BEX, CCS, bioenergy, all land-based and forest-based solutions, which are false solutions, there will be a huge land use change undergoing, and there is not much of land. What will happen to the agriculture? What will happen to communities who depend on agroecology, producing their food, their sovereignty over their food security? And so you cannot just arbitrarily say that we can do this, and this without taking into calculation that you don't have that much of land. And all those land and forests, again, as IPCC has repeatedly pointed out, and other scientists and studies have repeatedly pointed out, doesn't have the capacity to absorb that much of carbon, to remove that much of carbon from the atmosphere. And here lies, and this whole dependence on the land and forests for offsetting your emissions and pledging your net zero commitments and pledges is based on one flawed concept. And that flawed concept, the seed of that flawed concept is sown in Article 4.1 of the Paris Agreement, where they managed to put in that the anthropogenic emissions can be balanced out by carbon sinks, equivalent carbon sinks. And this has contributed and been spun into a false narrative of net zero as a climate solution. You are the fossil fuel emissions, that those are what we call geological, they have geological carbon. You cannot equate, even science tells you that you cannot equate geological carbon with terrestrial carbon. And there's a clear difference between the carbon that is emitted by the fossil fuel sector and the carbon that you refer to or relate to in terms of land and forests. These are not equal. It takes a lot of years, a scale of sometimes 70 to 80 years to remove geological carbon by forests or by restoration or by replanting. And so they cannot be treated as equal. So as there is no available land that is possible to fulfill these false pledges, the terrestrial systems doesn't also have that kind of capacity to remove that much of carbon. And in that sense, when we say that, even if we say that 50% of all the forests that we today have customary rights, but even 10 to 15% are not even recognized today by the various states across global north and south. So when you are actually into using this land and forests to fulfill your false pledges with the dangerous and drastic impact on them, the communities who are completely disenfranchised from their rights, their tenure rights, their rights over natural resources, their right to governance. And these are indigenous communities, women, frontline communities, even peasants and farmers. One can imagine the kind of impact that it is already happening. It's not imagining the impact will have on these communities, but their land, their livelihood, their culture, their rights will be undermined and will result in gross and huge violation of their right to their lands and territories and their governments over those land and territories. So this is not what we call and what they call transformative action. It's like fixing a crisis here and there. And so definitely it's not a system change. It doesn't even refer to some kind of a radical change in the discourse or radical change in finding a pathway to a real solutions for a zero carbon emission pathway. And so I would stop here at this point of time to see that how, to see that if Teresa can follow up from this.
Thank you very much, Souparna. Before we run on, I want to make sure that we get some of the clarifying questions out of the way. I'm having a look at the Q&A chat as well. Some of these questions are going to be answered later on. For example, how we can hold countries and organizations to account, I think, is an excellent one to save for the end discussion. I do see two. The first being, are carbon credits part of the net zero slogan? And the second being, how does net zero differ from carbon neutrality, or is it just the same thing? Souparna, Teresa, which one of you would like to pick these two up?
Yeah, I'm happy to have a go. And Souparna, you can add if you think there's more to say. Basically, I would say carbon credits are part of the strategy for theoretically achieving net zero. So the vast majority of the players announcing net zero targets, they're not planning to reduce their emissions, they're planning to buy carbon credits. So yeah, hopefully that helps clarify that piece. It's not necessarily in the slogan per se, but it is a key part of the strategy for sure. And how does it differ from carbon neutrality? Well, they are essentially the same thing, except for net zero can refer to all greenhouse gas emissions, so not just carbon dioxide, but also methane and nitrous oxide and other greenhouse gas emissions. And there's a way of calculating greenhouse gas equivalences that mean that you can, a certain number of molecules, carbon dioxide molecules are the equivalent of a certain number of methane molecules, and you can sort of theoretically cancel those out. So they're very, very similar concepts, but they can mean slightly different things depending on what the net zero scope is about.
Very good.
If I can add to it, this is where the whole narrative comes apart on net zero. Because if you go through the pledges, many of the corporates are talking of that we will become carbon neutral by 2025, or we are already carbon neutral in our operations by 2025 as a prelude to their net zero pledge or commitment or target, whatever it is. And a simple example, say the Landesbank of Germany, and this is a German bank, and there is a fund called Arboro Fund, which is a fund which promotes monoculture plantations across Africa and Latin America. And they are saying that they are removing carbon through these plantations, which say the project is for 15 years, and they are they're storing carbon, they're removing carbon, and they're also into using timber and wood for both furniture and bioenergy as a bioenergy fuel. Now, Landesbank has invested 3.2 million euros in the Arboro Fund, and they claim that their very investment to this 3 million euro to this fund make them carbon neutral by 2022. And this is how the force is coming apart. And this is where one has to understand that what are the pathways they are using to explain this whole net zero, circus, as we say. And this is where one should tear apart this false narrative.
I think that's a very clear answer, Souparna. I have the questions that I see in the chat now, I think are mostly questions that we can handle maybe near the end to see if we've covered those. I have a couple of clarifying questions just that I picked up on while listening to both of you. The first one I have is I've seen a lot of examples of bad plans by companies so far, right? Do you off the top of your head know of any companies that have made pledges that you'd be more comfortable with, or that maybe are more in line with the types of structures that you've advocated for?
I can talk of one. It wasn't a company, but it was a political announcement from the UK Labour Party in 2019. And that was under the former leader Jeremy Corbyn. They came up with a really strong net zero by 2030 target, which was all about transitioning away from fossil fuels, using just transition, using real structural change, using social protection, and thinking about all the different pieces of public transport and agriculture and all of that with basically no offsetting, no emissions, no assumptions about BECCS. It was the target was net zero by 2030, but basically it came down to real zero by 2030. That's a good example. That's the kind of thing we'd love to be seeing more of, but have yet to do so.
I mean that there are ways to give a net zero pledge that are good as well.
Theoretically, but it seems to be a rare occurrence.
Okay, that's quite a clear answer, I think, indeed. Then I've one other question, because I hear a lot, I've heard both land grabbing, right, and the impacts of making pledges from mostly northern countries and mostly the global northern companies, and then essentially claiming land in the global south. Now that sounds an awful lot to me like colonialism or some kind of climate colonialism. I think maybe could you speak on that as to how that works and what it actually means, like in daily life for people, right? Who are most likely to be impacted by this?
So, I mean, maybe we should clarify, are we, just for the second session, we can cover this if you like as part of our presentations. I don't know, Souparna, are you going to dive into that aspect for the second half, or should I cover that? Sorry, you're on mute.
Yes, whoever, if you want to dive into that, I'm fine with it. I can add where it's possible. But basically what means it is the impact on those communities in the global south. And so, and connecting it to the seemed colonialism, the aspect of colonialism. So there is a term which is quite popular, which is called carbon colonialism. And so probably that can explain a bit about why people are referring to carbon colonialism, and so how all of these carbon reduction and carbon reducing pledges, colonializes the land and forest, and there is a great possibility, and we are also seeing those kind of things. But yes, so it's the impact is not much different in the sense that if we start from conservation, let's say that conservation as a form of avoided deforestation is one form of solution, where if you see the REDD+ projects, they are clearly distinguishing between the avoided deforestation and then the carbon that they are trying to avoid as a commodity. And so what is happening is that the conservation method, the methodology of conservation has not much changed from the colonial times, and what we refer to the fortress model of conservation. So if you know that the fortress model of conservation means driving the communities who had actually nurtured and protected the forests and the resources were being driven out of those areas called protected areas, and they don't have access to anything in those areas. So how they're not only driven out of their land and territories, but their livelihood is destroyed, their whole property rights system is destroyed, and their cultural and spiritual links, the symbiotic links with nature, is snapped. Now, if that link is snapped, the vacuum does exist, but that vacuum is taken over by these carbon cowboys and the carbon traders, and then pushed as part of the carbon projects and the carbon credit projects. And so this mechanism exists and will be the same everywhere, even if you talk of monoculture plantations, you talk of restoration, or you talk of certified timber or wood extraction, or even the geoengineering kind of things. Like if you see Nviva's model connecting to tracks, as I said, is that grow plantations, harvest them, take them into pellet making, and supply them as a fuel for bioenergy. So it's the same model, because what you are trying to do is in terms of trying to grab the land that you need, and in trying to exercise and control over those land and forests, you will definitely have to undermine and snap the symbiotic relationship of those communities with those very forests and land. Otherwise, you cannot do what you are supposed to do. Because to me, as long as those communities are there on those land and territories, they have their rights over the collective resources. They can pursue their spiritual and cultural functions. They will be the biggest regulator and barrier to accessing those lands and forests by the corporates and the carbon traders. So the first impact should be to get rid of them. And the struggle begins here. And so the struggle begins here at this point of time. And so you will always see the indigenous people at the front line against any capital incursion in the indigenous territories, because they know once that capital comes in, it is first to destroy those links, destroy your culture, destroy your livelihood, and then automatically your property rights system, your governance system will be destroyed, and you and your entire symbiotic relation with nature will be snapped. So that's how you have to, this is colonialism. This is carbon colonialism, what they refer to.
Maybe I can jump in here as well and share as ActionAid, we've kind of been through this before. We're a global federation in 45 countries. And we have been through the fight for the biofuel land grab that took place between 2007 and 2012, when European and American, US efforts to come up with a climate solution, to replace fossil fuels in our cars, was to say, let's use biofuels. That's green, that's earth, that's plants, let's grow plants and process that into biofuels to run our cars. Great. So in fact, in most of Europe, there's a percentage of every of most of the petrol is actually from biofuels. So that led in 2007 onwards to a massive land grab, actually, because it meant that a lot of the land that had originally been used to grow food, to grow crops, to grow, but also ecosystems, got displaced to grow biofuel crops like maize, sugar, and palm oil to an extent for biodiesel and other needs. So the biofuel land grab led to globally about 30 million hectares of land grabs, and just that 30 million hectare land grab, which, by the way, 30 million may sound like a lot, but it's far less than is projected under the net zero and BECS land sequestration models. That led to masses of land grabs. So it was farming communities, in addition to the indigenous communities that Souparna talks about, you know, smallholder farmers, especially women farmers who don't necessarily have ownership, you know, land tenure over, or official land tenure over their land, but, you know, maybe grow their food on communal collective land. That was very easily grabbed by corporations, or sometimes even just given away by their governments to corporations. And that meant that communities were pushed off their land, pushed off their ecosystems. They lost the food that they were feeding themselves and their families. They lost the source of livelihood. And it meant that, in fact, food prices went up. So, and in many cases, dramatically, we saw in those years a very steep rise in food prices, because crops were being you know, food crops, staple crops were less available for local markets. And in fact, in some cases, that led to local riots and disruption. Even in Tunisia, that was one of the contributing factors that led to the Arab Spring Revolution, because people were so hungry, they couldn't afford to pay for the usual food that they were buying. So we saw just a catastrophic series of impacts, and we know that it's always the poorest communities, the ones that have to spend a greater proportion of their income on buying food, the ones who rely on that land to grow their food or to make their income, who will be affected. And it's often the women as well, who may be using land that is defined as marginal or idle, who then find that they can't access that land. And then therefore lose their livelihoods. So, but we're seeing that as much as the biofuel land grab took about 30 million hectares of land and was itself catastrophic, we're seeing BECS land use scenarios are potentially 10 or 20 or maybe even 100 times higher than what we saw with biofuels. So that's just basically meaning that, you know, with the whole net zero thing, global south communities will pay the price yet again. It just compounds the injustice of climate change, in which global south communities who are doing so little to cause the crisis are the ones who have to not only suffer the worst impacts of climate change, but in addition, suffer the impacts of the so-called solutions to climate change. So it's about shifting the burden, it's just shuffling carbon, and it is basically climate colonialism. Yeah.
Yeah, if I can add, I think Teresa also, you know, as she talked about, reminded me that we should also be conceptually clear about land uses when we talk about, you know, climate solutions and relationship with land and forest, that the colonial land use maps, how they have been used, you know, what are those barren lands, so-called barren lands? What are those so-called non-arable lands, you know, and how they used to demarcate and how they used to map. And if you go and if you approach a community and say the map says these are barren lands, these are non-arable lands, they will say no. Every land that you see here, and which we refer to as commons, has some relationship to our livelihood or our, you know, culture here, and often being used as grazing land or pasture land. And if you see in many parts of the world today, community struggles even against renewable projects are the reason for this. Like intensive wind farms or solar park, concentrated solar park, they are renewables, but they have been put on land, which is basically as part of the commons of the communities. And they were used earlier as pasture land, grazing land, and suddenly these have been enclosed and taken away, and huge windmills and solar, generators have suddenly been erected on that. And so one also has to think of the renewable world is also not very kind of a smooth run as part of a climate solution.
I think that's very, very clear. We have about 25 minutes left, and I know both of you still have a decent amount to cover. I think I would like, I'm going to leave it to you who wants to speak first. I know that we still have a little bit to cover on COP and net zero. And also, what I really want to get to is what are the real solutions that we're looking for that would put us on a path to 1.5. I think it'd be good to end our part with that, and then leave at least 10 minutes for some questions that are still popping up here and there. Souparna, would you like to start?
I think you go next, right? And then I can wrap up with the real solutions. You're on mute though.
Okay, so we are now going into what? Into the COP 2016. Maybe I'll attempt linkages to Article 6 and probably those kind of things. Yeah, and so those who may be aware of the Paris Agreement, definitely, but probably the what we are referring to in this case is the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which I said perhaps earlier that it's a mixed bag, where we say that 6.1 to 6.7 probably are referred to under two articles of 6.2 and 6.4. And these are basically market mechanisms, meaning that what they have been negotiated, the Paris Agreement text is something, and the basic of, if you say, what was there in the Article 6 was this article of the Paris Agreement promoted international cooperation towards implementation of nationally determined contributions, NDCs, to allow for higher ambition in mitigation and adaptation actions, sustainable development, environmental integrity, and to deliver an overall mitigation in global emissions. Now, these are what we find, you can say, reflect the spirit of Article 6. But after 5 long years of unending negotiations, this Article 6.2 and 6.4 and some of the paras under these two articles, which I referred to earlier as non-market mechanisms, and we definitely distinguish as market mechanism, and we definitely distinguish them from the non-market mechanisms, and I tell you why, has been turned mainly into an unilateral market approach, promoting carbon trading, promoting offsets and removals, masquerading as ambitious climate actions, and ignoring raising ambition through joint adaptation and mitigation actions. Though they say that these articles could raise ambitions, but basically these are false solutions, and at best can reflect false ambitions, and in no way helps the raising ambition through joint adaptation and mitigation actions. But if you contrast this with Article 6.8, which I referred and which we refer to as non-market mechanism, this is in the context of sustainable development and poverty eradication, this is in a coordinated and effective manner, including through mitigation, adaptation, finance, technology transfer, and capacity building. This Article 6.8 and 9, as agreed, can be used to raise ambitions through joint adaptation and mitigation actions. And this Article 6.8 differs from 6.2 and 6.4 because it doesn't talk of carbon trading. It doesn't base its mitigation and adaptation actions on offsets or even carbon removals exactly as they mean in the greater ambit of carbon trading. So now, if we go into that, how this relates to and why this push for both net zero in COP26 and the push to agree on the market mechanisms and Article 6 as a whole, is this, it's a kind of a paradox, you know. An agreement on Article 6.2 and 6.4, as it promotes all that you need as a pathway to net zero, can be strengthened. And so that's why you need an agreement on Article 6.2 and 6.4 as a dominant market approach, while ignoring the non-market approach under 6.8. And this selective focus on 6.2 and 6.4 is best a paradox that can be explained when you bring the net zero and the continuing business as usual approach as a framework, you know, to explain this paradox, which is Article 6, and the selective focus on 6.2 and 6.4. So if 6.2 and 6.4 is agreed to, it becomes easier to put certain methodologies relating to accounting of carbon emissions, carbon credits into the system. It becomes an agreed, a consensus instrument of the Great Paris Agreement, narrative as a climate solution. And the concept of nature-based solutions and net zero both can be achieved through the pathways as framed by 6.2 and 6.4. But why this selective approach to 6.2 and 6.4? And we see that negotiations are very weak on the issue of 6.8, because in essence, it talks of accelerated emission reduction and prevention. It talks of joint adaptation and mitigation approach through international cooperation. It talks of deep emission cuts while advancing equity under CBDR, which is common but differentiated approach. And it also follows a rights-based and gender-responsive ecosystems-based approach. The non-market approach.
Can I ask you to try to wrap up, Souparna?
Yeah, and so this is what can drive a real raising of real ambition, and it can act as an approach opposed to the net zero approach, opposed to the set of false solutions, and address the real drivers of climate change. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. And I will.
Niels, your connection there is pretty terrible, but I'm assuming that you pass things over to me. So, oh, wait, do my screen share first. Yeah, so I'm just going to wrap up quickly for the last few minutes to share just a little bit, to give you an idea of where, of the kind of action that we want and that we don't want. This is a set of graphs drawn from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's a big, august body of hundreds of scientists who every few years review all of the global published scientific data about climate change. And here in 2019, I think, they published a report on how to get to how to make sure that we stay under 1.5 degrees of warming. And basically they showed 4 scenario iterative pathways. The first pathway, P1, you can see the gray area is fossil fuel emissions. The brown area is agriculture, forestry and land use. And the yellow area is BECCS, that bioenergy with carbon capture and storage that we talked about, to, you know, the imaginary technology to suck carbon out the air. They said we could do it in, let's say, these 4 ways. We could either not rely on BECCS, just use a little bit of agriculture and forestry, and basically radically cut our emissions now, our fossil fuel and industry emissions now. And that means a steep curve from 2020, you know, basically, you know, getting to, this is global average, to get us to net zero by 2050, but really quite close to zero well beyond that, a steep cut now. The only other way, if we don't do those cuts now, we need increasing amounts of this yellow imaginary stuff, BECCS, to get us to zero, and thus to help us stay under 1.5 degrees of warming. So that shows us, really, since we know that BECCS is going to take up land that we don't have, that's going to require technology that may never exist, our only real solution to avoid runaway climate change is this path, something close to this pathway 1, which is radical emission reductions now. And so to remind ourselves that net zero is not real zero. Net zero is about you know, continuing to emit and just using land to offset the difference. Whereas real zero is about really transforming the energy systems, the forest, our transport systems, our food systems, our housing, all of that, to be able to bring emissions down and have like better, happier lifestyles, in fact. So real climate action means that we have to minimize the total amount of carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere, and as soon as possible. So bringing emissions down to near zero, protecting and restoring the biodiverse ecosystems that we do have. But that means that when we announce these climate targets, we don't want this combined net target. We want separate targets for greenhouse gas reductions and versus greenhouse gas removals, instead of combining them. So do you remember, like we talked at the beginning, there are 2 separate components in a net target. We want to see what corporations and governments are actually doing to reduce their emissions and how much they're relying on removals. That's a really key piece for us to see. And unfortunately, in the vast majority of the net zero targets that have been announced, it's really, there's no information about how much they're planning to rely on offsets. And so that's why we've got a lot of concern about how much land that will end up being. Instead, what we need is for governments to really dramatically transform and restructure our energy system. So we know that we need to move away from fossil fuels. That means not only shifting from from fossil fuels to renewables, but also shifting even the way that we mine resources for our renewable energy sector by actually recycling more of those minerals that are used in renewable energy, but also dramatically cutting the amount of energy that we use. We can't just use the same amount that we use and waste at the moment. We need to, but we also need to ensure energy access, equitable energy access for those communities that at the moment don't have energy access. And that's the great thing about renewable energy, is that it can be more equitably distributed. It doesn't put so much control over the energy source into the hands of one big corporation. You can have more equitable and distributed models of energy with renewables. So we need to follow that, but in the right way. And with agriculture, there's growing, but still not enough recognition that agriculture is one of the big causes of emissions, and that we need to radically transform away from the factory farmed livestock sector that we have, especially in the global north at the moment. Actually, at the moment, more global land is used and cut and deforested to grow food for feeding livestock than is grown to feed humans. And that's just a terrible waste of the world's land and resources. And it means it's actually going mostly to factory farmed, really, really polluting models of livestock farming that aren't helping the planet at all. Instead, we need better systems of livestock and less meat consumption. And we also need to move away from industrial agricultural production of crops, like where we dump a whole load of fertilizers and chemicals onto our fields, and instead use techniques like agroecology and mixed cropping and agroforestry, where we can actually grow food in really good abundance and in a way that helps, that really helps women farmers, smallholder farmers. It helps more equitable distribution of the farming wealth in local economies. We need to really restructure the way that we produce and grow and distribute food. And then when it comes to housing, transport, our industrial sectors, our economic systems, these all really need to be rethought through, but whilst doing so, to make sure that as we make those transitions, that that communities that could be affected by the change are involved in planning better, more equitable alternatives, and that the transition actually addresses inequalities rather than exacerbating them. And just as a top tip, there's an upcoming webinar hosted by ActionAid Netherlands as part of this series to go into more detail about just transitions. But I'll move on in the meantime, which is to say that we do need then our climate targets. Instead of just saying net zero by 2050, we need much more ambitious milestones for 2025 and 2030, so that we can get as close to zero by 2030 preferably. And also we need our wealthy polluting countries, such as those of us in Europe and the US, to be the ones to act first, because they're the ones with the most responsibility, and to do their fair share, and of course to provide climate finance, and so to the global south, so that those countries can make that transition. So you can also hear more about that in a future workshop.
Perfect. Thank you, Teresa. Yeah, we hadn't plugged the next two webinars yet, but we will indeed have one next week on just transition, mostly focused on extractives and agriculture, touching on what Teresa just mentioned. And then 2 weeks after that, we're going to have one on climate finance, which dives fully into the idea of what a fair share is in the relationship between the North and the South. I would like to get Souparna and Teresa to both show themselves again while we handle the last three remaining questions that we have. The first one, it's been up there for a while, is what can we do to hold countries and big organizations accountable for misleading us with net zero? And I think that ties in quite clearly with also, what can climate activists be demanding in solidarity, if we can handle both of those questions together. Whoever wants to pick it up.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I'll go. So, I mean, there are a range of actions that we could do to hold them accountable. First of all, we need to look at what their net targets say. Are they being explicit about their change? And if they are, in companies like Shell, for example, bless them, they're, big polluting company, they plan to continue polluting, but they somehow also plan to have a net zero by 2050 target. And what they have done is published part of the pathway to get there, telling us how much they plan to offset. And we have, and by using the information that they included, embedded somewhere in their targets, we did some digging and we found out that actually they were planning to use so much, they were planning to do so much offsetting by 2030, just on the path to getting to net zero by 2050, that they would have required land 3 times the size of the Netherlands in order to meet their 2030 interim target for offsetting. So that has helped us to really call out their efforts, you know, both in media, social media, including in the court case that ActionAid Netherlands and others were part of recently in The Hague. So that's one way of doing it, is seeing what they're saying. But many other net zero targets announced by corporations haven't told us how much they plan to rely on offsets. In fact, the majority of them are just super vague. They don't tell us whether or how much offsetting they're planning to use. So then we have to call that out as well. So I think that there are a range of things we can do. We need to both call out the concept of net zero so that the world, the media, the public, the governments don't accept it as a solution anymore. So that's part of the work. But we also have to call out the corporations. We have to pick strategic corporations to call out as well, to try to push them to change. And I think that one of the key points coming up will be COP26, because there is a lot of pressure coming, including from the UK government, to celebrate net zero targets as getting us on the path. But at COP26 and beyond, we're going to have to be calling it all out and really calling for real zero. I think the way we can do that best is by showing the bar of what needs to happen, that real transition, and comparing it to what is actually happening. And so that will help, I think, people to understand the gap in action that still exists in spite of all this net zero sloganeering.
Excellent, thank you. Souparna, do you have anything to add to that?
I think, yeah, apart from what Teresa is saying, you know, one is a lot of awareness generation, providing real clarity to these concepts that we are referring to, net zero, false solutions among the civil society organizations, the general public, and like there are published reports. Everybody should try to disseminate, you know, communication materials like the Big Con report, or the real zero, or the net zero is not real zero, those kind of reports, and the promoting shareholder actions. That one way in the global north we have seen getting some results, pressurizing those corporations by the shareholders, for holding the corporations accountable for their actions, is one that in many cases have given some kind of results, but may continue and may give even better results. Apart from that, the global south, you know, there is a need, and it's growing, it takes time. There's a need to build struggles from local to global level. And as information and awareness permeates from the global level to the local level, more local struggles are based on specific countries where these companies have their facilities, production, you know, extraction facilities, their farms and all that. And that's where the communities need support for generating struggles and amplify them from the local to region to global forum. And that voice has to come in forums like UNFCCC or the CBD or the UN food systems, which is going on now. These are the areas where those voices need to be amplified so that we can link up the community voices to the global civil society voice and voice their concerns from the local struggles.
Very good, very clear. We are at 8:30. I have one more question that I think we can maybe handle in under a minute, I'm hoping. And that is, what are your views on nature for debt swaps? And I think, again, whoever wants to pick it up, but as succinctly as possible.
I think we should just have debt relief, full stop. We shouldn't turn it into another way for northern countries to create ownership and sovereignty over the global
Natural
south
resources.
nature ecosystems.
Yeah,
Debt
as
swaps.
simple as that.
So, debt, cancel debt, protect nature, don't put them together.
Perfect. I think that's very clear. I want to thank everyone who tuned in for listening to us and indulging us in one of our favorite subjects in net zero. It's been something that's become a bit of an obsession over the last 12 months. So I'm very happy to have had Teresa and Souparna here. They mentioned disseminating some reports. Those reports are in the chat. Please do read them. Please do share them amongst your colleagues, amongst your friends, amongst whoever you think might have an interest in them. For the people who are part of the full summer school program, we're going to be leaving the Zoom environment and shifting over to Teams, where Teresa and Souparna will be joining us as well for a bit of a meet and greet. But with that, I want to thank everyone. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you, Souparna. And thank you, Soraya, who people haven't seen, but she's been supporting us behind the scenes. And I will leave it there. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Niels. Thank you, ActionAid Netherlands, and thank you, everyone else.
Are you sending a Teams link?